Hello everybody, this is Albert with Green Tea House. I hope you're doing well today. Today we're going to finish the series on the social history of tea in England and talk about the rise of the tea bag. Now before we begin, if you haven't been here already, come check us out here in New Braunfels, Texas. Green is a little town outside of New Braunfels. And also subscribe and hit the notification bell if you haven't done so already, so these episodes come fresh to you. And of course, post a comment. So we're finishing up the series on the social history of tea in England. And now we're in the 1930s, and a lot of things change around this time. So we've talked about the tea bag in other episodes in the history of tea playlists. So there's a couple of people that have apocryphal stories that are ascribed to as inventing the tea bag. The most famous being Thomas Sullivan. He was a New York merchant in the early 1900s, and he was at a tea auction. And like the Chinese teas, a lot of these are kind of apocryphal stories. But he was at a tea auction. You remember how tea used to be sold loose leaf, and there'd be tea auctions for different wholesale providers would buy it and then sell it to retail or sell it to stores. And then he just noticed that there was a lot of debris under the table or on the ground. And so he collected these up and put them into nylon bags. And his intention was not for people to put these bags into water in themselves, like the present day tea bag, but rather that it was going to be a carrying device, and then people were going to do it the traditional way, which is put the leaves in a kettle and then brew the tea and then use a strainer to get the tea out, and the leaves would still stay in the kettle. But enough people enjoyed it the way it was and were doing it, keeping it in the bag, that it really moved from there. There was also a couple from Milwaukee, Lawson and Fuller, if I remember correctly, were their names, who actually filed for a patent earlier than that, around 1900, for something that would hold tea. But as far as I know, that patent was never approved, or nothing came of it. So really, Sullivan is kind of seen as the father of tea bags. So there's a couple of factors. So you look, tea bags started in the early 1900s, but really didn't get big until a couple of factors, both in the UK and in England. And I would say that they got bigger in the United States before they got bigger in the UK. Because in fact, the Brits, of course, were tea snobs. We have an episode here on 2 factors that lead to tea snobbery. And of course, understandably so, they're going to have a much more snobby view of tea bag tea than the Americans would. But the big factor was World War II. And what happened with World War II was rationing. And we think of rationing of gasoline, rationing of sugar, but they rationed tea. And so tea was rationed more so in the UK than in the United States. But at the same time, every GI was given some tea because they knew it was important. I mean, tea was so part of the ethos of England that, like a little bar of chocolate, they were going to get tea as well. So at this time, understandably so, World War II, they in their backpack, they're not going to be able to always have a kettle with them. So this was kind of a move toward tea bags. But even if you look in 1950, the amount of people using tea bags in the UK was about 5%. And then when you look by 1997, it's 97%. And today it's still very high, like around 90%. And so what really happened? Well, after World War II, you saw kind of the move, and you saw a lot of expos, right? We saw expos in the US, expos in England. I mean, even going back to Crystal Palace, Queen Victoria in the 1840s, 1850s. But there was definitely a move after the World Wars to kind of have this suburbanization, this idea of modernization. Think of the Jetsons, think of all these, oh, we're modern now. We want to no longer have to do menial chores. So these companies push like the dishwasher and the washing machine and the vacuum. And so we were caught up in this time in the 50s and 60s of kind of shunning the menial household chores and doing things faster because that was modern. And so you have to put yourself in this milieu at the time where this was kind of the feeling. And so the Brits would look aghast at the Americans, and even Brits who went to America and tried tea bags because they were more pervasive over in the US were just like, really? You're going to put this in a bag? And eventually they switched from nylon, and in the 20s and 30s you really saw different companies trying different things. Some would do gauze, some would do paper and so forth, because they had to find the right kind of fabric to do it. But the Brits were not impressed prior to 1950. And then Tetley, the UK tea company, was really big in pushing the tea bags. Lipton as well here in the States. and in the UK as well. We know Lipton originally got his start in Sri Lanka, former Ceylon. But they were the ones pushing it with hardcore advertising. We talked about the importance of advertising in the 19th century. So certainly they were pushing it in catalogs and in newspapers to housewives in the 1950s and 60s, the convenience of tea bags. And so you really saw it take off in the UK, starting really in the 60s and 70s, 80s, 90s. And so fast forward to my childhood and most of your childhoods, it was tea bag tea. It was always tea bag tea. And this is why, which is convenient, right? The same reason where you see in our competitor beverage with coffee, how instant coffee, Folgers, Nescafe, all this was around the same time because it was all on this push for modernity, push for make your life easier, on the go, quick and easy. And of course, with all these types of things, you see that the quality control is not there. And so the quality of tea bag tea diminished. And it's not shocking because Thomas Sullivan was using the sawdust or the fannings of the tea leaf as a whole. So it was already low grade stuff when the tea bag was invented. They weren't putting super flowery, tippery, pico, one of the super high levels of black tea. We have an episode here on the categories of black tea. They weren't doing that. No, I mean, this is big companies, right? Big business. They're going to try to give you the most inferior product because they want to save money on it. And so we grew up in the era of just low grade tea. And if you ever cut open a tea bag, and Casey does this on some of the Instagram videos and Facebook videos, if you cut open a tea bag of your Earl Grey or your English blend or your green tea, because it's never like an actual green tea like Genmaicha or Longjing or something, it's just green tea. Cut it open, pour it out, you're gonna see it's just sawdust, right? It's fannings, it's low grade. So that's what happened. So you see this kind of turnaround around maybe 2000. And there were a couple of factors with the reawakening of artisanal tea. And I've talked about it here, how I see within 20 years, artisanal tea and tea consumption is going to rival coffee consumption. Here in the States, coffee consumption is still a little high, but tea consumption is pretty high. About 50% of Americans are consuming some sort of tea a day, where coffee consumption is around 75%. But you're going to see this rise, and you saw in the last 20 years with artisanal tea. So like, for example, if we would go back in time to 1997 here in Texas, there's no way we would have a tea store. It's just, there was no awareness. But you saw this slow awareness. And on some level, you have to attribute it to artisanal coffee. So even though we see kind of Starbucks now as the McDonald's of coffee, at the time in the late 90s, there was this reawakening of the Arabica bean and the Robusta bean, even though Starbucks doesn't use Robusta. But this reawakening of great quality coffee, like in places in Italy, they're like, we've always had good quality coffee, but over here it was a big thing. So you saw this, and so the tea industry kind of mimicked that. And so there was this underground, so to speak, kind of tea movement, that loose leaf tea was still around, and you really saw awaken in the last, I would say 15 to 20 years, and certainly now there's a great awareness to it, and you do see day after day, yes, people are still drinking from tea bags, but day after day you see it, people are throwing out their tea bags and they're going to loose leaf, and whether or not they're putting them in a tea bag or putting them in a infuser or in a kettle or whatnot, we're going back to the tea as it was meant to be drunk since the Ming dynasty, where the emperor made a promulgation that all tea had to be loose leaf. Prior to that, it was cakes. Prior to that, it was grounded up leaves, kind of like matcha today, but all tea was grounded up like that. We have previous episodes on that. So we're kind of going back to our heritage of loose leaf tea, and slowly but surely you're going to see more and more Americans throughout the tea bag. And yes, the tea bag is convenient, but we have so many infuser types now out on the market where there's no good reason to use tea bag, because it's inferior tea, but also if you want to put loose leaf in a tea bag, it doesn't allow the leaves to expand. So there's really no reason to be buying grocery store tea bag tea, because you have good quality of loose leaf tea out there. But that's the history of the tea bag, and you slowly start seeing it in the UK as well, this shirking, this eschewing of the tea bag. And I think the United States is ahead right now of the UK in terms of really embracing loose leaf tea. Guys, post in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, take care and God bless.